Vael's talons hovered inches from the Thraxian's throat. The creature, the thing that had shackled her people and starved her kin, lay broken on a table of white light. It was helpless. But the human, the one called Kalen, didn't step aside. He didn't offer her the blade or the satisfaction of a finishing blow. Instead, he pressed his fingers against the Thraxian's chest, feeling for a pulse with a terrifying sort of tenderness. He looked up, his eyes weary but fixed. He told her that the anatomy of an enemy is identical to the anatomy of a victim. Mercy is the most dangerous weapon in the deep dark, he whispered, though he didn't stop his work. 3 cycles ago, Vael had expected fire. When the heavy doors of the Thraxian slave barge were torn outward by the force of a human boarding party, she had braced for a new kind of ending. She had watched from the dark corners of her cage as the humans moved through the ship. They didn't move like the Thraxian slavers, who were all jagged edges and sudden violence. These creatures were fluid, efficient, and strangely quiet. Their heat was palpable, a radiating warmth that felt like a physical weight in the cold, oxygen-starved hold. They had brought her to the Aegis 7. The ship was a mountain of cold alloy and humming energy, a place that felt more like a tomb than a vessel. Vael walked the corridors with a heavy heart, waiting for the mast to slip. She waited for the humans to drag their captives to the center of the deck for execution. She waited for the sounds of screaming that usually followed a conquest. But the screams didn't come. Instead, there was only the low, a constant thrum of the engine beneath her feet and the distant chime of internal communications. She passed soldiers who ignored her, their faces etched with a fatigue she recognized all too well. They weren't celebrating. They were cleaning rifles and sharing rations. The air in the ship tasted of filtered minerals and something sharp, like the electricity that danced across the Thraxian shock prods. She found the medbay by following the scent of copper and chemicals. It was a place of white walls and stinging light. Vael expected to see her rescuers being tended to, while the Thraxians were left to die in the corners. But in the center of the room, under a halo of surgical lamps, Kalen was working. He was a small man compared to the Thraxian on the table. His skin was pale, dampened by a sheen of sweat that caught the light. Oh, he wasn't looking at the medals on his chest or the weapons at his hip. He was looking at a wound. Vael stepped into the circle of light. The anger in her chest was a living thing, a heat that could keep a soul alive forever if she let it. She looked at the Thraxian, the one who had overseen the culling in the lower decks, and she felt the phantom weight of her chains. Kalen didn't look up when she approached. He just reached for a fresh vial of stabilizing fluid. "Stop," Vael said, her voice a series of clicks and whistles that the ship's translator struggled to smooth into human speech. "Why do you help the demon?" The human paused, his hand still buried in the blue-stained cavity of the enemy's torso. "Truth is," he said, his voice barely a murmur, "choosing to care is a heavy habit to break." Vael's hand tightened, her talons trembling just inches from the Thraxian's throat. The creature, the monster that had overseen the culling in the lower decks, let out a sound. It wasn't a roar of defiance or a final curse. It was a high, thin whistle of air through a punctured lung. Its eyes, wide and glossed with a film of shock, fixed on her. In that moment, the monster vanished. What remained was a shivering, dying thing that knew its end was near. It was the same look her brother had given her before the barges pulled away from their homeworld. It was a universal biological signature of pure, childlike terror. Kalen didn't move. He didn't flinch. He reached for the last injector on his tray, his hand shaking just enough to be visible under the harsh surgical lamps. The medicine inside was rare, in the kind of resource that was usually reserved for high-ranking officers or the humans themselves. He wasn't saving a soldier. He was saving a memory of hate, and yet his fingers were steady as he pressed the device against the Thraxian's side. The machine hissed. The creature's pulse, erratic and faint on the monitor, began to stabilize. Vael felt the fire in her chest bank down into a cold, heavy ash. She watched the human's face. He wasn't looking for thanks. He wasn't even looking at the Thraxian anymore. He was simply existing in the space between a choice and its consequence. The cost of combat was written in the deep lines around his mouth, and the way he leaned against the table as if his bones had turned to lead. Hours passed. The Aegis 7 settled into a deep, rhythmic thrum as it drifted away from the wreckage of the slave fleet. Vael navigated the corridors, her own feet feeling heavier with every step. She found Kalen in the heart of the ship, tucked away in a maintenance nook near the engine core. The heat here was intense, a physical pressure that made her skin itch. But it was the only place that didn't feel like a graveyard. Kalen was slumped against a bulkhead, his head back and his eyes closed. He looked small. He looked like someone who had carried a mountain for 1,000 miles and finally allowed himself to drop it. His hands, still stained with the fluids of 2 different species, rested uselessly in his lap. Vael didn't say a word. She didn't offer a platitude. She simply sat down beside him on the warm metal deck, the vibration of the ship moving through both of them. She looked at his hands and then at her own. She realized then that she had been looking for a reason to hate him for helping the enemy, but all she found was a reflection of her own exhaustion. The enemy had a personhood she had spent a lifetime trying to ignore. It was easier to kill a monster than it was to face a mirror. Truth is, the weight of his decision was now her own. She understood the cost of his code. It was a heat that could keep a soul alive forever, even in the freezing dark of the stars. Slowly, carefully, Vael reached out. Her hand was larger than his, her skin tougher and scarred by years of labor in the pits. She slid her fingers between his, interlacing them. She felt the sudden, sharp heat of his palm, a steady and quiet warmth that defied the cold steel around them. Kalen's fingers tightened around hers in return, and a silent acknowledgement of the burden they now shared. It was a heavy habit, this caring, and as the ship cut through the black, she decided it was a habit she was finally ready to learn.